December 5, 1975, Manor Township, Pennsylvania. 19-year-old Lindy Sue Biechler should have been planning her future. Instead, she lay dead in her apartment, stabbed 19 times. A kitchen knife from her own home pierced her neck, a tea towel wrapped around the wooden handle. Blood painted the walls. The killer vanished without a trace. For 47 years, families grieved. Investigators preserved evidence, chasing shadows. The case went cold. Hope faded. But in 2022, a discarded coffee cup changed everything. DNA technology and genetic genealogy finally identified the murderer hiding in plain sight. The arrest shocked a community that had waited nearly 5 decades for answers. David Sinopoli had lived among them all these years, a neighbor, a familiar face. The man who destroyed Lindy's life and shattered a town's sense of safety had been there all along. How do you live next door to a killer for 47 years and never know? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The winter air bit sharp on December 5th, 1975. As evening settled over Manor Township, Lancaster County, streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows between modest homes where families gathered for dinner. It was the kind of quiet Pennsylvania evening where nothing terrible was supposed to happen. The snow had begun to fall earlier that day, dusting the sidewalks and creating a postcard scene of small-town tranquility. Lindy Sue Biechler, 19 years, old with dark hair and bright eyes, moved through her small apartment on Barbara Street. She had been looking forward to the weekend, making plans with friends, dreaming about her future like any young woman should. The apartment was neat, comfortable, a place where she felt safe in a community where everyone knew everyone. Her parents lived just a few miles away. Her childhood friends remained close. This was home, where nothing bad ever happened to people like her. She had spent the day at work, chatting with coworkers about weekend plans. Friday evening meant freedom, relaxation, maybe a movie with friends, or a quiet night reading. Lindy was known for her warm smile and gentle nature. Neighbors often saw her walking to the corner store or tending to the small garden outside her building. She represented everything good about small-town America, young, hopeful, trusting in the basic decency of the world around her. But safety was an illusion that died with her. The first responders who entered her apartment that evening would never forget what they found. Officer Michael Patterson, a 15-year veteran of Manor Township Police, had seen traffic accidents and domestic disputes, but nothing had prepared him for the scene in Lindy's apartment. Lindy lay on the floor, her life stolen by 19 brutal stab wounds to her neck, chest, back, and upper abdomen. The violence was shocking, personal, filled with rage that seemed to echo off the walls even hours after the attack. A kitchen knife. Her own kitchen knife remained embedded in her neck, a tea towel wrapped carefully around its wooden handle. The killer had thought about fingerprints, about evidence, yet had left the weapon behind like a grotesque signature. Blood spattered the walls like abstract art painted in horror, telling a story of desperation, struggle, and unimaginable brutality. Patterson had to step outside twice to collect himself before he could continue documenting the scene. The apartment told a story of forced entry and desperate struggle. The front door showed scratches around the lock, furniture was overturned, a chair knocked over, a lamp broken on the floor, magazines scattered across the room. Personal belongings were scattered, as if someone had searched frantically for something, or as if Lindy had fought back with everything she had. Signs pointed to someone who had broken in, someone who had brought violence into this quiet corner of Lancaster County. Detective Sergeant Robert Hayes arrived within 20 minutes of the initial call. A 22-year veteran with a reputation for methodical investigation, Hayes surveyed the scene with the cold professionalism that helped him process horrific crimes. But even he felt shaken by the brutality. This wasn't a simple robbery gone wrong. This was something darker, more personal, more devastating. The killer had spent time here, had inflicted wounds that suggested either personal rage or the work of someone deeply disturbed. Word spread quickly through Manor Township. Neighbors gathered on street corners whispering in hushed tones about the police cars and ambulances that had descended on Barbara Street. Parents called their children inside earlier than usual. Hardware. Store owner Bill Morrison would later report that lock sales increased by 300% over the next week. The comfortable assumption of small-town safety evaporated like morning mist. replaced by the cold realization that evil could strike anywhere, even here. Mrs. Helen Wagner, Lindy's neighbor in the apartment below, told police she had heard sounds of struggle around 7:30 p.m. Thought of furniture moving, what might have been shouting, then silence. She had considered calling police but convinced herself it was just young people being loud. The guilt would haunt her for decades. She had been so close, separated by mere inches of floor and ceiling, yet unable to help when Lindy needed it most. Manor Township police sealed off Barbara Street as investigators began their painstaking work. Yellow tape fluttered in the December wind while neighbors watched from behind curtains, straining to understand what had happened to the young woman they had seen walking past their windows just hours before. Detective sergeants photographed every angle, documented every detail, preserved every piece of evidence they could find. They knew this case would demand perfection. Lindy Sue Biechler deserved nothing less than their absolute best. The knife itself became evidence number one. A common kitchen knife from Lindy's own drawer, the kind found in thousands of homes across Pennsylvania, but the careful way the tea towel was wrapped around the handle suggested someone who had planned, someone who had thought about fingerprints. The killer had shown both premeditation and panic, organization and chaos. He had brought protection against leaving prints yet had left the weapon behind. Detective Hayes, supervised as crime scene technicians, dusted for fingerprints throughout the apartment. They collected hair samples, fiber evidence, anything that might have come from the attacker. They photographed blood spatter patterns, measured distances, documented the position of every piece of overturned furniture. Most importantly, they found biological evidence on Lindy's underwear semen that would someday become the key to everything. In 1975, DNA analysis didn't exist outside of scientific theory. But Detective Hayes had attended enough forensic seminars to understand that science was advancing rapidly. He made a decision that would prove crucial decades later. Preserve everything, every sample, every fiber, every potential piece of evidence was carefully labeled, documented, and stored in climate-controlled conditions. He couldn't know that DNA testing lay 20 years in the future, but he understood that some case might need every advantage science could provide. The medical examiner, Dr. Elizabeth K.S., confirmed what the scene already told them. 19 stab wounds, ranging from shallow defensive cuts to deep penetrating injuries that had caused massive internal damage. Multiple defensive cuts on Lindy's hands showed she had fought back. She had tried to grab the knife, had struggled against her attacker, refusing to surrender without a fight. Her fingernails contained skin tissue. She had scratched her attacker, fighting for her life until the very end. The pattern of wounds suggested the attack had lasted several minutes. The killer had not simply struck once in rage and fled. He had continued the assault, inflicting wound after wound with methodical brutality. Some cuts were precise, others showed the wild slashing of someone in a frenzy. Dr. K.S. had performed hundreds of autopsies, but the sustained violence of this attack disturbed even her professional detachment. The news of Lindy's murder dominated local television and radio broadcasts that weekend. Channel 8 News led with the story for 3 consecutive nights. The Lancaster New Era ran front-page coverage with a photograph of Lindy's high school graduation just 2 years earlier. She had been voted most likely to brighten your day by her classmates. A cruel irony given how her death had darkened an entire community. The funeral filled Manor Township's largest church to overflowing. St. Matthew's Lutheran Church had been built to accommodate 400 people, but more than 600 mourners crowded into pews, aisles, and the vestibule. Lindy's family parents, Robert and Margaret Biechler, siblings David and Susan, sat in the front pew, faces etched with grief that would last a lifetime. The young woman they remembered was full of warmth, kindness, and promise. She had been planning her future, talking about college, about dreams that would never come true. Robert Biechler, a quiet man who worked at the local paper mill, struggled to understand how someone could have done this to his daughter. He had taught Lindy to trust people, to see the good in everyone. Now that trust felt like a betrayal, a naive worldview that had somehow contributed to her death. He would spend the rest of his life wondering if he had somehow failed to protect her. Margaret Biechler wept quietly throughout the service, holding a photograph of Lindy from her high school prom. She had been so proud of her daughter, so excited about the future that lay ahead. Lindy had been planning to enroll in nursing school the following fall. She wanted to help people, to make a difference in the world. Instead, the world had taken everything from her in one night of unimaginable violence. Community members filled every available seat. Many had known Lindy since childhood. They remembered her smile, her laugh, her gentle nature that had made her beloved throughout the school district. Mrs. Patricia Coleman, Lindy's fourth-grade teacher, remembered a kind child who had always helped struggling classmates with their homework. Now she struggled to reconcile those memories with the violence that had ended her life. Fear mixed with sorrow as the congregation realized that whoever had done this was still out there, still walking among them. The killer could be anyone. A stranger passing through town, or worse, someone they knew, someone they trusted, someone who might even be sitting among them in the church pews at that very moment. Pastor Richard Muller spoke about evil in the world, about faith surviving in the darkest times, but his words felt inadequate against the magnitude of what had happened. The pastor spoke about loss, about faith in the face of evil, about trusting that justice would someday come. But sitting in those wooden pews surrounded by flowers and tears, justice felt impossibly far away. The killer had vanished without a trace. No witnesses had seen anyone suspicious. No evidence pointed to any specific individual. Pastor Muller's assurance that the truth will eventually be revealed seemed like wishful thinking rather than prophecy. After the service, they carried Lindy to Conestoga Memorial Park, where her grave would become a place of pilgrimage for decades. The procession stretched for nearly a mile, with cars pulling over as the hearse passed. Family members lingered long after the other mourners departed, unwilling to leave her alone in the cold ground. The December wind cut through their winter coats as they stood beside the fresh grave, asking questions that had no answers. Who had done this? Why Lindy? Would they ever know the truth? David Biechler, Lindy's older brother, made a promise at her graveside that December afternoon. He would never stop looking for answers. He would never let the case be forgotten. He would make sure that whoever had killed his sister would eventually face justice, no matter how long it took. It was a promise that would sustain him through 47 years of frustration and false hope. The investigation consumed Manor Township police. Throughout the winter of 1975, 76, Detective Hayes assembled a task force of 6 investigators who worked 12-hour shifts following every possible lead. They interviewed everyone who had known Lindy, mapping her final days hour by hour. They spoke with friends, co-workers, neighbors, anyone who might have seen something unusual. They checked alibis, verified stories, followed every possible lead, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. Detective Patricia Reynolds, the department's only female investigator, took the lead on interviewing Lindy's female friends and co-workers. Through these conversations, a picture emerged of a young woman without enemies, someone universally liked and trusted. Lindy's best friend, Karen Hutchinson, described their last conversation just days before the murder. They had discussed Christmas plans, upcoming movies, and Lindy's excitement about her future nursing career. Nothing in her manner had suggested fear or concern about anyone in her life. Early suspects emerged and were systematically eliminated. Thomas Chen, a former boyfriend from high school, provided a solid alibi. He had been working the evening shift at Lancaster General Hospital with dozens of witnesses. The relationship had ended amicably 2 years earlier, and both had moved on without animosity. Neighbors' stories checked out under scrutiny. Mrs. Wagner's account of hearing struggle around 7:30 p.m. was corroborated by Mr. Franklin across the street, who had noticed unusual noise from the building around the same time. Delivery drivers who worked the Barber Street route were questioned extensively. United Parcel Service driver Jim Morrison had made his regular delivery to the building that afternoon, but had seen nothing unusual. The postal carrier, Ellen Davies, remembered delivering mail to Lindy's box, but noted that the apartment had seemed quiet and normal. Repair workers, meter readers, anyone who might have had legitimate access to the apartment building was questioned and cleared through alibis and character references. The investigators were thorough, methodical, determined not to let the killer slip away through careless work. They established a timeline of Lindy's final day that accounted for every hour from her departure for work that morning until her body was discovered that evening. She had worked a normal shift at her job at Lancaster County Social Services, where she processed welfare applications and helped families navigate the bureaucracy of public assistance. Co-workers described her mood as normal, even cheerful. That final Friday, She'd been looking forward to the weekend and had mentioned plans to do Christmas shopping with her sister Susan. Her supervisor, Mrs. Catherine Walsh, remembered Lindy staying a few minutes late to finish paperwork, demonstrating the conscientiousness that had made her a valued employee despite her youth. But as weeks turned to months, the leads grew cold. The initial surge of tips and potential witnesses dried up as the reality set in that the killer had left remarkably few traces. The case files grew thicker with reports and interviews, but no clearer picture of the killer emerged. By Lindy's first anniversary, December 5, 1976, the investigation had stalled despite hundreds of hours of detective work and dozens of potential leads pursued to dead ends. The family held a memorial service that first anniversary. Fewer people attended than had come to the funeral, but those who came brought the same questions that had haunted them all year. Pastor Mueller led prayers for justice and closure, but his words carried the weight of unanswered questions. Manor Township felt different now, less trusting, more guarded, forever changed by the knowledge that evil had walked among them and vanished without consequence. Local businesses installed new security measures. The apartment building where Lindy had lived upgraded its locks and added exterior lighting. Young women throughout Lancaster County became more cautious, more aware of their surroundings. Parents drove their daughters to evening activities rather than letting them walk. The murder had changed not just one family, but an entire community's sense of safety and trust. Throughout the late 1972 and early 1980s, new detectives rotated onto the case, each bringing fresh eyes and renewed energy. Detective Mark Stevens took over primary responsibility when Hayes retired in 1979, bringing new investigative techniques and a determination to solve the case that had frustrated his predecessor. They re-interviewed witnesses, re-examined evidence, pursued new theories about the killer's identity and motivation. Stevens believed the killer was local, someone familiar with Lindy's routines and the layout of her apartment building. The forced entry suggested some planning, but the brutality of the attack indicated either personal rage or severe mental instability. He developed profiles of potential suspects, focusing on men in their 20s and 30s who lived within a 5-mile radius of Barbara Street. But the killer had left surprisingly few traces. No fingerprints on surfaces where they should have been found. No witnesses who had seen anyone suspicious near Lindy's building. No clear motive that pointed toward any individual. The biological evidence remained preserved in the department's evidence locker, waiting for technology that didn't yet exist to unlock its secrets. By the mid-1980s, Lindy Sue Biechler's murder had officially become a cold case. The files were moved to storage, though never forgotten. The case folder had grown to over 300 pages of reports, witness statements, and investigative notes. The case that had once dominated local headlines faded from public attention, remembered mainly by family members and the investigators who couldn't let it go. Detective Stevens, now promoted to sergeant, made a practice of reviewing the file every December 5th. He would spread the photographs and reports across his desk, studying them for details that previous investigators might have missed. The case had become a personal obsession, a professional failure that haunted his otherwise successful career. He retired in 1989 without solving it, passing the responsibility to a new generation of investigators who inherited both the evidence and the frustration. The 1990s brought new possibilities in forensic science. DNA analysis, once the stuff of science fiction, became a reality in criminal investigations. Cold case units across America began revisiting old evidence, hoping that modern science could unlock secrets that had been hidden for decades. Lancaster County established its own cold case unit in 1995, with Detective Lieutenant Sarah Morrison taking charge of reviewing unsolved murders dating back to the 1060 seconds. Morrison had studied forensic science at Penn State and understood the revolutionary potential of DNA testing. When she reviewed Lindy's case file, she immediately recognized the significance of the biological evidence that had been carefully preserved since 1975. The semen sample found on Lindy's underwear represented the killer's genetic fingerprint, waiting 20 years for technology to catch up to its potential. In 1997, 22 years after Lindy's murder, Lancaster County investigators submitted the biological evidence for DNA testing. The laboratory work took 3 months as technicians carefully extracted genetic material from the degraded sample. The results were both encouraging and frustrating. They successfully extracted a complete male DNA profile from the semen found on Lindy's underwear. For the first time, they had a genetic fingerprint of her killer, a unique identifier that could definitively link him to the crime. The profile was entered into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, a national database that compares DNA evidence from crime scenes with known offenders. If the killer had committed another crime and been arrested anywhere in America, the system would flag the match. Detective Morrison waited hopefully for the computer to identify their suspect, checking the database weekly for any hits that might finally provide a name to go with the genetic profile. But no match came. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months, months to years. The DNA profile sat in the database, a perfect genetic description of the killer, but without a name to attach to it. The man who had murdered Lindy Sue Biechler had either never been arrested for another crime, or he had committed his crimes before DNA collection became standard procedure in criminal arrests. Morrison theorized that the killer might be dead, which would explain the lack of subsequent crimes or arrests. Or perhaps he had moved far from Pennsylvania after the murder, committing no other crimes that would result in DNA collection. The most frustrating possibility was that he was still alive and free, simply careful enough to avoid arrest for any crime that would require DNA sampling. The turn of the millennium brought both hope and heartbreak for families with cold cases. Advances in DNA technology allowed for more sensitive testing, better profiles from degraded samples, expanded databases that included more offenders. But for Lindy's case, the result remained the same: a perfect genetic fingerprint with no name attached. The Biechler family had grown older, carrying their grief. Robert Biechler passed away in 1998, without ever knowing who had killed his daughter. Margaret followed in 2004, taking with her decades of unanswered questions and unresolved sorrow. David Biechler, now middle-aged with children of his own, became the primary keeper of his sister's memory and the family's hopes for justice. Family members grew older, carrying their grief in different ways. Susan Biechler, now Susan Martinez with 3 daughters of her own, had become overprotective of her children, never allowing them the freedom that had been normal in her generation. The murder had taught her that evil could strike anywhere, that safety was an illusion that could be shattered in a single evening of violence. David Biechler had channeled his grief into advocacy, working with other families of murder victims to push for better funding of cold case investigations. He testified before the Pennsylvania legislature about the importance of preserving evidence and upgrading laboratory capabilities. His sister's case had become a cause, a mission that gave meaning to decades of loss and frustration. New generations of Manor Township residents heard Lindy's story from their parents and grandparents. The case became local legend, the unsolved murder that had changed their community forever. Children who hadn't been born when Lindy died grew up knowing her name, understanding that sometimes justice was delayed, sometimes evil went unpunished for decades or longer. The story was passed down like folklore, but with the weight of real tragedy. Parents used it to teach their children about being careful, about the reality of evil in the world, about the importance of community vigilance. Lindy Sue Biechler became more than a victim. She became a symbol of vulnerability and the precious nature of safety that most people took for granted. The 2010s brought revolutionary changes to cold case investigations. Genetic genealogy emerged as a powerful tool using DNA evidence to build family trees and identify suspects through their relatives. Companies like Parabon Nanolabs began partnering with law enforcement, applying genealogical research techniques that had been developed for family history to criminal investigations. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. C.C. Moore, a genetic genealogist who had gained fame for helping people find their biological parents and long-lost relatives, began working with law enforcement to solve cold cases. Her techniques involved comparing crime scene DNA with public genealogy databases, then building family trees to identify potential suspects through their genetic relatives. Lancaster County detectives, now a new generation removed from the original investigators, refused to let Lindy's case remain cold. Detective Captain Robert Chen, whose parents had immigrated from Taiwan in the 1960s, brought a fresh perspective and determination to solve cases that had stymied previous generations. He had studied the Biechler file extensively and understood that new technology might finally provide the breakthrough that had eluded investigators for decades. Chen reached out to Parabon Nanolabs and genetic genealogist C.C. Moore, hoping that advances in genetic genealogy could finally provide the break they needed. The department allocated $15,000 from their investigative budget to fund the genetic genealogy work. Understanding that this might be their last best hope for solving one of Lancaster County's oldest cold cases, C.C. Moore was a specialist in building family trees through DNA analysis. She had earned a reputation for solving seemingly impossible cases by tracing genetic connections through generations of ancestry records. When she examined Lindy's case, she saw familiar challenges: old evidence, degraded samples, a suspect who had avoided detection for decades. But she also saw opportunities that hadn't existed when the crime was committed. The process began with phenotyping using DNA to predict the killer's physical characteristics. The analysis suggested he was likely of Italian ancestry with dark hair and eyes, medium build. This information helped narrow the search, providing investigators with a general profile of their suspect. The phenotyping results indicated someone who would blend easily into the Italian-American communities that were common throughout Pennsylvania. But the real breakthrough came through genetic genealogy. Moore began building family trees using public genealogy databases, looking for matches between the killer's DNA and distant relatives who had voluntarily submitted their genetic information to ancestry websites. It was painstaking work tracing bloodlines across centuries of immigration records, marriage certificates, birth records, and census data. The investigation focused on Italian families who had immigrated to Pennsylvania in the early 20th century. Immigration records from Ellis Island provided crucial information about family names, arrival dates, and settlement patterns. Many Italian immigrants had settled in Lancaster County and surrounding areas, drawn by agricultural opportunities and existing Italian communities that provided support for new arrivals. Moore worked with genealogical records that stretched back to Italy itself, tracing family lines through church records and municipal documents. She built family trees that included hundreds of individuals looking for genetic connections that might lead to the killer. The work required expertise in both genetics and genealogy, combining scientific analysis with historical research. As Moore traced family lines forward through the generations, certain names began to appear repeatedly in her research. The Sinopoli family emerged as a possibility. Italian immigrants who had arrived in Pennsylvania in the 1922 and established roots in Lancaster County. Their descendants still lived in the area, including several men who would have been the right age to commit the murder in 1975. One name in particular caught Moore's attention: David Sinopoli, born in 1952. He would have been 23 years old at the time of Lindy's murder. He lived in Lancaster County, had Italian ancestry that matched the phenotyping results, and had no significant criminal record that would have placed his DNA in CODIS. He was in many ways the perfect candidate for someone who could have committed murder and avoided detection for decades. David Sinopoli was unremarkable in every way that mattered to his neighbors. He worked as a maintenance supervisor at a local manufacturing plant, a job he had held for over 20 years. He paid his taxes, mowed his lawn, attended community events. He had married his wife Carol in 1982, and they had raised 2 children together. To everyone who knew him, he was simply a quiet, ordinary man who lived a quiet, ordinary life. Sinopoli had lived in Lancaster County his entire life, graduating from McCaskey High School in 1971. After high school, he had worked various blue-collar jobs while living with his parents in a small house on Maple Avenue. In 1975, he would have been a young man figuring out his place in the world, struggling with the same challenges that faced many 23-year-olds of his generation. But beyond these basic facts, nothing about him suggested he was capable of violence. Neighbors described him as polite but reserved, someone who kept to himself but was always respectful in their limited interactions. His work supervisors considered him reliable and competent, if not particularly ambitious. He seemed to be exactly what he appeared: an ordinary man living an ordinary life in small-town Pennsylvania. The investigators began discreet surveillance in early 2022, 47 years after Lindy's murder. They needed a DNA sample from David Sinopoli to confirm whether he was their killer, but they had to be careful. If he suspected he was being watched, he might flee or destroy evidence. The surveillance had to be subtle, professional, and patient. Detective Maria Santos, now leading the cold case unit, coordinated the surveillance operation. A 15-year veteran with experience in undercover work, Santos understood the delicate balance required. They needed to observe Sinopoli's routines, identify opportunities to collect DNA evidence, and build a case without alerting him to their investigation. For 3 weeks, investigators discreetly watched Chiappelli's daily routine. He left for work at 7:15 a.m. every weekday, stopped at Dunkin' Donuts for coffee, arrived at his job by 8 a.m. He ate lunch at the same diner 3 days a week, shopped for groceries on Saturday mornings, attended Mass at Street Anoni's Catholic Church on Sundays. He was a creature of habit, predictable in ways that made surveillance easier, but also suggested a methodical personality that might plan crimes carefully. February 2022 brought the break they needed. Investigators followed Sinopoli to his regular coffee shop, watching as he ordered his usual drink, medium coffee, black, no sugar, and sat at his regular table near the window. He read the Lancaster paper while drinking his coffee, spending exactly 25 minutes in the shop before leaving for work. When he finished and left, Detective Santos quickly entered the shop and collected the discarded cup, preserving the saliva that would either confirm or eliminate him as a suspect. The DNA testing took several weeks, each day feeling like an eternity for investigators who had waited decades for this moment. The laboratory compared Sinopoli's genetic profile from the coffee cup with the DNA from Lindy's underwear, looking for the matches that would definitively identify him as the killer. The lab technicians understood the significance of their work. They were potentially solving a murder that had haunted a community for nearly half a century. Detective Santos checked with the laboratory daily, understanding that the results would either vindicate decades of investigative work or send them back to square one in their search for Lindy's killer. The anticipation was almost unbearable for investigators who had inherited this case from previous generations and felt the weight of nearly 50 years of family grief and community trauma. The results exceeded their most optimistic expectations. David Sinopoli's DNA matched the evidence from Lindy Sue Biechler's murder with a probability so high, it was essentially certainty, more than 99.99% likelihood, that he was the source of the biological evidence found at the crime scene. After 47 years, they had found their killer. He had been living among them all along, hiding in plain sight, carrying the secret of what he had done to a 19-year-old girl on a cold December evening in 1975. The match was conclusive, undeniable, scientifically certain. David Sinopoli had raped and murdered Lindy Sue Biechler, then lived free for 47 years while her family grieved, and investigators searched for answers. The ordinary man who had seemed so unremarkable, so normal, had been concealing one of Lancaster County's most heinous crimes. Detective Santos immediately called District Attorney Craig Steedman to report the breakthrough. Steedman, who had prosecuted numerous cold cases during his career, understood the significance of finally solving the Biechler murder. This wasn't just another case. It was the resolution of a tragedy that had defined Lancaster County law enforcement for nearly half a century. July 2022 brought the arrest that shocked Lancaster County. David Sinopoli was taken into custody at his home, 47 years after he had murdered Lindy Sue Biechler. The arrest warrant was served by Detective Santos and 4 other officers who found Sinopoli working in his garage on a Saturday morning. He offered no resistance, seeming almost relieved as he was handcuffed and informed of his rights. The news spread quickly through Manor Township and beyond, carried by local television stations and newspapers that remembered the case from decades past. Channel 8 News, which had covered Lindy's murder in 1975, led their evening broadcast with the arrest. The Lancaster New Era ran a front-page story with side-by-side photographs. Lindy as a beautiful 19-year-old and Sinopoli, as he appeared in his booking photo, a gay-haired man of 70 whose ordinary appearance belied the monster he had once been. Community members who had lived through the original investigation felt a mixture of relief and disbelief. The killer had been among them all these years at community events and local businesses, perhaps even at the memorial services held for his victim. Carol Sinopoli, his wife of 40 years, was devastated by the revelation. She had known David as a quiet, gentle man who helped elderly neighbors with yard work and never showed any signs of violence or rage. The realization was both vindicating and disturbing for Manor Township residents. Their long-held belief that evil could hide behind ordinary faces had been proven correct in the most unsettling way possible. David Sinopoli had attended the same church as some of Lindy's family members. He had shopped at the same stores, lived in the same community, breathed the same air as the people who had mourned his victim for decades. For Lindy's surviving family members, the arrest brought complex emotions. David Biechler, now 68 years old, had waited his entire adult life for this moment. Relief that the killer had finally been identified, mixed with grief for all the years lost to uncertainty. His parents had died without knowing the truth. His sister Susan had raised her children in fear, never fully trusting the world's safety. They had waited nearly 5 decades for this moment, watching parents and siblings pass away without ever knowing the truth. David Biechler spoke to reporters outside his home, his voice breaking as he described the mix of relief and sadness that accompanied the arrest. Justice was finally coming, but it could never restore what had been taken from them. Not Lindy's life, not their parents' peace of mind, not the decades of grief and uncertainty that had defined their family. Susan Martinez, Lindy's younger sister, had built her entire adult life around the fear that her sister's killer might still be free. She had taught her daughters to be cautious, to never fully trust their safety, to understand that evil could strike without warning. The arrest validated her caution, but also highlighted the cost of living with such fear for nearly half a century. The legal proceedings moved forward with deliberate pace. District Attorney Steedman assigned his most experienced prosecutors to the case, understanding that the eyes of the criminal justice community would be watching this prosecution of a 47-year-old murder. Prosecutors reviewed decades of evidence preparing their case against David Cipolla, while his defense attorneys faced an almost impossible task. How do you defend against DNA evidence that has waited 47 years to speak? Public interest in the case was enormous. True crime enthusiasts who had followed cold cases for years recognized this as something special. A case that had spanned nearly 5 decades, solved by cutting-edge genetic genealogy that represented the future of criminal investigation. The story attracted national attention, appearing in newspapers and on television programs across America. The case became a symbol of how modern science could reach back across decades to deliver justice. News programs featured interviews with C.C. Moore and other genetic genealogists, explaining how family trees and DNA analysis had cracked a case that had stumped traditional investigation for nearly half a century. The success story provided hope for thousands of other cold cases across America. October 19, 2023 brought the resolution everyone had waited for. Lancaster County Courthouse filled with spectators, including aging family members who had never stopped believing this day would come. David Biechler, now using a cane to walk, sat in the front row with his sister Susan and other relatives. Behind them sat community members who remembered the original investigation, reporters who had covered true crime for decades, and law enforcement officers who had inherited the case from previous generations. Media representatives packed the gallery, documenting the end of one of Pennsylvania's oldest cold cases. Cameras captured every moment as David Cipolla, now an elderly man with gray hair and reading glasses, was led into the courtroom in handcuffs. He wore a standard orange jail uniform that seemed to diminish him, making him appear as ordinary and unremarkable as he had been for decades. Judge David Ashworth, who had presided over numerous high-profile cases during his career, understood the significance of this moment. This wasn't just another criminal sentencing. It was the conclusion of a tragedy that had haunted Lancaster County for nearly half a century. The courtroom fell silent as Cipolla stood before the bench, flanked by his defense attorneys. The courtroom fell silent as he spoke the words that officially ended 48 years of mystery. Guilty. He pleaded guilty to third-degree murder, aggravated assault, and burglary. His voice was quiet, almost inaudible as he acknowledged his crimes. The admission sent ripples through the packed courtroom, ending decades of speculation and uncertainty with 2 simple syllables. The guilty plea meant there would be no trial, no prolonged legal proceedings that might traumatize the family further. Cipolla's attorneys had advised him that the DNA evidence was insurmountable, that a jury would certainly convict him of first-degree murder if the case went to trial. The plea agreement allowed him to avoid the death penalty, while ensuring he would spend the remainder of his life in prison. After decades of denying family members the truth after living free, while his victim lay in her grave, David Cipolla finally acknowledged what he had done to Lindy Sue Biechler on that December evening in 1975. The words seemed to lift a weight from the courtroom, as if 47 years of uncertainty had finally been resolved with his simple admission of guilt. Judge Ashworth sentenced Cipolla to 25 to 50 years in prison, ensuring he would spend the remainder of his life behind bars. At age 71, even the minimum sentence meant he would likely die in prison, paying for the crime he had committed as a young man nearly half a century earlier. The sentence carried additional requirements. Sinopoli was ordered to pay more than $25,000 in DNA laboratory costs, covering some of the expenses of the genetic genealogy work that had finally identified him. The financial penalty seemed almost trivial compared to the emotional cost his crime had inflicted on the Biechler family and Manor Township community. But it represented a tangible acknowledgement that justice required resources that solving cold cases demanded, investment in technology and expertise that could reach back across decades to identify killers who thought they had escaped consequences. In a moment that surprised many observers, Sinopoli offered an apology. Speaking quietly, he expressed remorse to Lindy's family for the decades of pain he had caused them. He also apologized to his own wife and children, who had lived unknowingly connected to a killer for decades. The words seemed inadequate after nearly half a century of silence, but they represented the first acknowledgement of responsibility he had ever made. His apology was brief, halting, delivered in a voice barely audible to the packed courtroom. He spoke of regret for his actions, of understanding the pain he had caused, of accepting responsibility for choices made as a young man that had destroyed multiple lives. But the words seemed hollow after 47 years of silence, 47 years of allowing a family to suffer without answers. The courtroom remained silent as Sinopoli's words echoed off the walls. For family members who had waited their entire adult lives for this moment, the apology was both meaningful and insufficient. Nothing could restore Lindy's life or erase the years of grief and uncertainty. But finally hearing the truth, finally knowing that justice had arrived, provided a form of closure they had never expected to receive. David Biechler later told reporters that hearing Sinopoli's apology provided some measure of peace, even though it could never compensate for the decades of loss. "It doesn't bring Lindy back," he said, "but at least we know the truth. At least he finally admitted what he did to our family." Local media covered the sentencing extensively, recognizing the end of Lancaster County's oldest cold case. Reporters who had covered true crime for decades understood the significance of what had just occurred. Genetic genealogy had solved a case that traditional investigation had been unable to crack, providing hope for thousands of other cold cases across America. The story resonated beyond Lancaster County, appearing in national publications and television programs. True crime podcasts devoted episodes to the case, explaining how genetic genealogy had revolutionized cold case investigation. C.C. Moore appeared on numerous television programs, describing how family trees and DNA analysis had finally identified Lindy's killer after 47 years. For the Manor Township community, Sinopoli's conviction brought a complex mixture of emotions: relief that the killer had been identified and punished mixed with disturbing realization that he had lived among them for decades. Community members recalled interactions with Sinopoli, wondering what signs they might have missed, what clues they might have overlooked. The case became a testament to the power of persistence and advancing technology. Investigators who had worked on Lindy's murder in the 1972 and 1980s had done everything right, preserving evidence, maintaining detailed files, never officially closing the case. Their foresight had made the eventual solution possible, proving that good police work could eventually be rewarded even decades later. Detective Hayes, now in his 80s and long retired, watched the news coverage from his home in Florida. The case that had frustrated him for years had finally been solved, vindicating his decision to preserve every piece of evidence. He called Detective Santos to congratulate her, understanding that the solution had required not just modern technology, but also the foundation of careful investigation laid decades earlier. C.C. Moore and the Parabon Nanolabs team received recognition for their role in solving one of Pennsylvania's oldest cold cases. Their work demonstrated how genetic genealogy could unlock secrets that had been hidden for generations, providing answers to families who had waited decades for truth. The success of the Biechler case led to increased funding for cold case units across America. The DNA evidence that solved the case represented a triumph of both science and patience. The biological sample collected in 1975 had waited 47 years to reveal its secret, preserved by investigators who understood that someday technology might advance enough to read the genetic code left behind by Lindy's killer. It was a vindication of scientific method and careful evidence preservation. As news of the conviction spread, other cold case investigators took notice. If genetic genealogy could solve a 47-year-old murder in Lancaster County, perhaps it could solve their own long-dormant cases. The success story provided hope for families across America who had been waiting years or decades for answers about their own loved ones. Police departments nationwide began reviewing their oldest unsolved cases, looking for biological evidence that might yield DNA profiles suitable for genetic genealogy. The Biechler case had proven that no case was too old to solve, that justice could be delayed but not permanently denied as long as evidence was preserved, and investigators refused to give up. Lindy Sue Biechler's grave in Conestoga Memorial Park became a place of pilgrimage once again. But this time, visitors came not just with questions but with answers. Family members who had spent decades wondering if they would ever know the truth could finally tell Lindy that her killer had been found, that justice had finally arrived. David Biechler made regular visits to his sister's grave throughout the months following Sinopoli's conviction. He would sit beside the headstone and talk to Lindy about the resolution of her case, about the family members who had passed away without knowing the truth, about the peace that came with finally having answers. The conversations helped him process the complex emotions that accompanied the end of his lifelong quest for justice. The headstone that had stood silent for nearly 5 decades now marked not just a victim's resting place, but a victory for persistence, science, and the belief that truth cannot remain hidden forever. Fresh flowers appeared regularly, left by family members and community members who remembered Lindy not just as a murder victim, but as a young woman whose life had been cut tragically short for investigators who had worked on the case over the decades. Sinopoli's conviction provided professional vindication and personal closure. They had never stopped believing that someday they would identify Lindy's killer. Their patience and careful preservation of evidence had finally been rewarded with the arrest and conviction they had pursued for nearly half a century. Detective Santos spoke at law enforcement conferences about the importance of evidence preservation and the potential of genetic genealogy to solve cold cases. The Biechler case became a model for how modern technology could be combined with traditional investigative work to achieve justice decades after crimes were committed. The story of Lindy Sue Biechler's murder and David Sinopoli's eventual conviction became more than just a cold case resolution. It became a symbol of hope for families waiting for answers, a demonstration of how advancing technology could reach back across decades to deliver justice, and a reminder that truth has its own timeline that cannot be rushed or abandoned. Manor Township would forever be changed by both the original crime and its eventual resolution. The community that had lived with fear and uncertainty for 47 years could finally move forward knowing that the killer who had shattered their sense of safety was behind bars where he belonged. Children could play outside without the shadow of an unsolved murder hanging over their neighborhood. In the end, Lindy Sue Biechler's story became a testament to the power of memory, persistence, and advancing science. Her murder in 1975 had seemed destined to remain forever unsolved. But the dedication of investigators and the breakthrough of genetic genealogy had finally provided the answers her family deserved. The case file that had once represented failure and frustration now stood as evidence of success and vindication. David Sinopoli would spend the remainder of his life in prison, paying for a crime he had committed as a young man in a moment of unimaginable violence. Justice had been delayed, but it had not been denied. For true crime followers who had watched the case unfold, Lindy's story represented everything compelling about cold case investigations: the patient work of dedicated investigators, the power of advancing science, the persistence of families who refused to give up hope, and the ultimate triumph of truth over deception. The coffee cup that provided the crucial DNA evidence became a symbol of how modern investigation techniques could solve even the oldest cases. A simple piece of discarded trash had finally revealed the identity of a killer who had hidden successfully for 47 years. It demonstrated that in the modern era, criminals could run but could never completely hide from advancing forensic science. As the legal proceedings concluded and David Sinopoli began serving his sentence, Lancaster County could finally close one of its oldest and most haunting cases. The murder that had terrorized Manor Township in 1975 and remained unsolved through decades of investigation had finally been resolved through the combination of careful police work and revolutionary genetic science. Lindy Sue Biechler's legacy would forever be intertwined with the advancement of forensic science and the dedication of investigators who never stopped believing that truth would eventually prevail. Her case had become a beacon of hope for other families waiting for answers. Proof that no case is ever truly hopeless as long as someone continues to search for the truth. The quiet streets of Manor Township could finally rest easy, knowing that the killer who had shattered their community nearly half a century earlier was behind bars. Children could walk safely again. Parents could sleep peacefully and neighbors could trust each other once more. The long nightmare that began on December 5, 1975 had finally ended with David Sinopoli's conviction in 2023. In the final analysis, Lindy Sue Biechler's story became more than just another true crime case. It became a testament to the enduring power of hope, the advancement of science, and the unwavering dedication of those who refused to let killers escape justice. Her memory would live on, not just as a victim, but as a symbol of truth's ultimate victory over deception, no matter how long that victory might take to achieve. The resolution of Lindy's case provided hope for thousands of other families across America who continue to wait for answers about their own loved ones. It proved that time does not erase evidence, that science continues to advance, and that dedicated investigators never truly give up on seeking justice for the innocent victims of violent crime.